story is what I need to tell, bringing God the glory and my brother's strength. A faith story written new today, with Jesus only, author of my faith.
Good morning and welcome to Faith Stories. Thank you for joining me on this Saturday morning. Today's faith story is about Esther, and you will find this in the Old Testament. In fact, Esther gets a whole book to herself. Esther's faith story unfolds against a backdrop of God's sovereignty over history, over his people, and over the destiny of one young girl and her cousin. But it's also the story that you could imagine being set in some Hollywood blockbuster. There is the big fight of good against evil. There's royalty in the palace, and then people in the streets of the city. There's conspiracy and plot and revenge, courage and bravery from ordinary people. And there's also a story of culture, customs and context that actually when we read it sometimes we don't really understand and maybe don't even agree with what it's saying, but it was the culture of the time and we have to go with that. And so at the time of Esther, who was a young Jewish girl, the king was called King Ahasuerus, and he was the king of Persia. The story is set in the city of Susa, the capital city of Persia. Ahasuerus has just dethroned his queen because she wouldn't do what he asked her to do, and he wanted to make an example of her. And so he starts to look for a new queen. And all the beautiful young virgins are to be gathered from every province in the city of the kingdom to be brought to the palace and to be prepared to become possibly the next queen. And whoever would please him would gain that title. Mordecai is Esther's cousin. He is a Jew like her, and he is her guardian because her parents were both killed. She is an orphan. And they were captured originally by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Well, Esther was very beautiful, so when the young women were gathered, Esther was also chosen. And she won the favour of Haggai, who was in charge of the harem. And so she advanced within the harem. Chapter 2, verse 9 tells us that she wins favour. Mordecai had told her not to disclose her heritage in order to protect her. It would be dangerous for Esther for them to know that she was a Jew. Yet every day he would pass by the court of the palace to watch over her and to make sure she is fine. Well, that whole next year would be a year of beautifying and preparation to meet the king. It was a year-long spa for these girls. And she would go spend the night with the king when asked to. And then the next morning she would move back to the harem. And she would never go back to the king unless he asked her. But then he would choose who his queen was going to be. And in chapter 2, verse 15, it tells us that God's hand was on Esther. She was winning favour in the eyes of all who saw her. The king did choose her. He loved her more than the others. She won grace and favour. And in chapter 2, we read that she was made the queen. Meanwhile, and this is a really important piece of information in the story, so remember this. But meanwhile, Mordecai foils a plot against King Ahasuerus. He hears of an attempt on the king's life, and he tells Esther, who informs the king, and he is saved. The king promotes Haman, the Agagite, above all his other officials and has ordered everyone to obey Haman and to bow in his presence. Well, Mordecai would not bow before him, and Haman was filled with fury. Haman knew that he was a Jew, and so he plotted to not just destroy Mordecai, but in fact to destroy the entire Jewish race. And so he told the king about the Jews, that they were different, that they weren't loyal to him and they should not be tolerated, and that the king should make a decree that these people would be destroyed. And he even said to the king that he would give 10,000 talents for the king's treasury. And indeed, the king agreed. He gave him a signet ring to make the decree and to seal it with the royal seal of approval. And governors were sent everywhere, all over the kingdom, so that people would know that on a certain day, all of the Jews were going to be annihilated, killed, and destroyed. In chapter 3, verse 13. And the city was turned into confusion, while the king and Haman were celebrating over a drink. Well, God's people are sent into just weeping and lamenting and fear and panic, awaiting their fate. Mordecai begins to fast and pray and dress in sackcloth and ashes. Esther in the palace as queen now, she learns of this terrible plight, sees Mordecai dressed in sackcloth, and is wondering what is going on. And so she sends her attendant to go and find out more in chapter 4, verse 8. This is the moment in the faith story where the significance of Esther's position and her favour become clear. And Mordecai knows this well. But Esther responds in fear to his plea in verse 11, because he says to her, you're the one that needs to save us. And she said, I can't do that. You can't just go and see the king. You have to be given permission. When you come into his presence, he has to raise his golden scepter. And it could even be on fear of death for her. But then comes the sobering reply from Mordecai, the reply from her family. He was her cousin. He loved her. He had raised her like a daughter. And we read in verse 13 and 14 of chapter 4, when Mordecai says to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And Esther accepts the call and requires her people to fast for 3 days to prepare, because then she would go to the king. And sure enough, 3 days later, she puts on her royal robes and she waits in the outer courts. The king sees her and he does raise the golden scepter to bid her come. And this is Esther's moment. So she requests the company of the king and Haman at a banquet that she has prepared, and he agrees to this. And this is a part in the story where things become very clear. As we read of Haman's pride and ego, his hunger for power and recognition, we just know that a fall is about to come. He's just so full of himself. And when Mordecai continues to refuse to bow to him, Haman is filled with such wrath and anger towards him that with the encouragement of his friends and his power-hungry wife, Haman decides to build gallows where Mordecai will be hanged. The next moments in the story display such precision timing in the sequence of events. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the king cannot sleep, and he orders the history books to be brought to him. Perhaps he's thinking that these history books will be so boring that they will help him fall asleep. But on reading the entries, he realizes that Mordecai was never rewarded for saving him that time previously from the death threat. And at this point, right at that very moment, Haman arrives at the palace. He's come to discuss the gallows where he wants Mordecai to be hanged. The king sees him and he calls him in. And you know, Haman is so puffed up with himself and so full of his own self-importance that he actually thinks the king is talking about him when he asks him this question. Haman, what should I do to honor a man who delights in me, who has pleased me? And so Haman is thinking, well, this is me. So here's my answer. And he starts this long rhetoric in great detail. Royal robes, a royal horse, a royal procession, great recognition and pomp and honor. But in the twist of the plot, the king replies, do this all for Mordecai. Well, it has gone terribly wrong for Haman. And even his wife, who had previously inspired him with the plot, realizes and basically tells them, your time is up. Chapter 7 is the final scene. The king and Haman are feasting with Esther. This was her request. And so, of course, this feast was going on over a few days. It wasn't just a simple dinner they had. And the king says to Esther again, what is it that you want? You can have up to half of my kingdom. What is it you want, Esther? And this was the moment that she had been born for. This was the moment that Mordecai was talking about. And she begs the king to save her life, and she discloses her heritage. And not just to save her own life, but to save that of her people. The king cannot believe what he is hearing. Who would do such a thing? Who would send such a decree? And she points and says, wicked Haman. The king is enraged. He loves Esther. She had won his favor. Well, Haman throws himself at the mercy of Queen Esther, but his fate is sealed. And in a moment of dramatic irony, a guard standing nearby just reminds the king of those gallows that have been prepared earlier. And in chapter 7, verse 10, we read the king say, yes, hang him on that. The king rewards Esther and Mordecai receives promotion. Esther gives her emotional plea to save her people, to write an order to revoke the letters that were originally devised by Haman. And the good news is delivered to all parts of the kingdom. In chapter 8, verse 16, it says, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. There was great rejoicing and celebration. Days of remembrance would be set aside every year to commemorate this incredible moment. Mordecai is second in command to the king. And the Bible tells us that he was great because he sought the welfare of his people and was a man of peace. And a young Jewish girl was pivotal in that moment of history. Did you realize that God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther? But his sovereignty and faithfulness are written all over the pages. His fingerprints of orchestration and provision and power and favor are evident all along the way. And I want to suggest that even more today in 2020, this faith story inspires us and encourages us today that God is at work as we look at the world stage and this moment in history, that our God is sovereign and in control. He is on the throne. And we look up to see that, and yet we also look within. This faith story reminds us that we have a part to play because each of us were born for such a time as this. All our lives matter to God. Our story may not be as dramatic as Esther and Mordecai, but it is just as important. I don't want to miss my part in God's story. Do you? Thank you for joining me today on Faith Story. Join me next week when I will have a special guest, so you need to come check us out and find out who that will be. And remember, let God write your faith story and then go live it.
And my brother's strength